On the evening of June 9, 1995, a small Arkansas town gathered for Little League Baseball. Under the glow of field lights and the hush of a summer night, children chased fireflies while parents talked in folding chairs. Among them was 6-year-old Morgan Nick, who had come with her mother, Colleen Nick, to the Wofford complex in the town of Alma. Morgan wore a bright t-shirt, laughed with friends, and for a few minutes the evening felt ordinary until, in a short span of time, she vanished from the parking area near the bleachers. The moment a child disappears, the clock begins to rule everything that follows. Decisions are made, resources mobilized, and mistakes small or large can set a case on a path that lasts for decades. This is the story of those first hours, the procedural challenges that followed, the investigative missteps investigators later identified, and the ways a community and a family kept a missing child's name alive. It is not a sensational retelling. It is an inquiry into how the human, technical, and institutional realities of policing intersect in a small-town crisis and what those intersections taught law enforcement lessons that would echo through future missing child responses. It was a routine stop on the summer calendar: Little League games, the soft crush of grass beneath cleats, the smell of hot dogs and popcorn. Families parked near the diamonds, folding chairs lined the sidelines, and children chased pockets of light near the tree line. At about 10:45 p.m., witnesses would later say, Morgan and several friends asked to leave the stands and chase fireflies near the parking lot. Morgan's mother allowed it. A few minutes later, Morgan was last seen near the family car, shaking sand from her shoes. When the other children returned to the stands and Morgan did not, alarm followed quickly. Volunteers scoured nearby areas. Parents called out names into the dark. The ordinary night had unraveled into the urgent search for a missing child. In the minutes that followed, witnesses offered fragments. One or more adults described a man speaking to Morgan. Several people remembered a red pickup truck with a camper shell parked close to the parking area. Those details, a stranger, a vehicle would thread through the investigation for years. But in the immediate aftermath, the scene was chaotic. Dozens of people in motion, limited lighting, and the pressure of time. In a missing child case, those early chaotic conditions are where small procedural choices can have outsized consequences. Law enforcement uses the phrase, golden window, to describe the critical early period after a disappearance, those first hours when memories are fresh, physical evidence is most likely to be preserved, and suspects, if present, may still be nearby. The effectiveness of the initial response often determines whether an investigation starts with a firm foundation or with fractured leads that must be reconstructed later. When Alma officers arrived, they faced an immediate management problem. The ballpark was not a controlled crime scene. Parents, neighbors, and volunteers had fanned out, calling names, searching fields and woods, and leaning over cars and under bleachers. In 1995, many departments, especially small, rural agencies, lacked standardized mass search protocols and extensive training for large-scale volunteer coordination. The response was human, urgent, and well-intentioned. But well-intentioned activity can inadvertently disturb evidence. Shoe prints are trampled, vehicle interiors are entered, and items are moved as worried people search for children. Those realities complicated the work of investigators from the start. Securing a scene quickly, establishing a clear command post, logging who enters and leaves the area, and creating a perimeter are basic police practices in modern missing child responses. In Alma, the speed at which volunteers and acquaintances moved through the parking area made it difficult to apply strict scene control in the first hours, and that loss of control would echo through subsequent lines of inquiry. One of the most persistent complications in the early investigation was the nature of witness statements. Under stress, memory fragments easily. Different observers filter the same moments through separate experiences and emotions. Children remember different details than adults. Memory can be shaped by fear, conversation, and the passage of time. That night, several children recalled a man near Morgan as she adjusted her shoes. Some adults described a red pickup truck with a white camper shell parked in the lot. But when officers began interviewing dozens of witnesses, they found inconsistencies. Descriptions varied on the man's height, clothing, and features, recollections about the direction of the truck's movement and the timing of an unknown person's presence did not align neatly. Each contradictory detail required meticulous documentation and follow-up. What this created was not necessarily negligence, but noise, a constellation of possible leads that required triage. In a complex investigation, distinguishing between signal and noise, credible, corroborated observation versus confusion or rumor becomes as important as any laboratory test. Investigators in the days after Morgan's disappearance had to do that work in real time, under pressure. As news of Morgan's disappearance spread, tip lines lit up. Calls arrived from neighbors, distant relatives with adopted theories, and people who thought they had seen something several states away. A missing child's case often becomes a public phenomenon, and the inflow of information can be both a blessing and an organizational burden. Every tip required documentation, verification, and often fieldwork. Detectives had to prioritize which leads were most credible, which tips had specific, verifiable details that could be checked quickly, which required travel and resources that a small department might not have on short notice. Triage systems today, software to log and rate tips, trained call takers to gather standardized initial information, and protocols to route significant leads to a central investigative team did not have the same presence in every jurisdiction in 1995. The sheer volume of tips in Morgan's case meant detectives spent substantial time following leads that ultimately proved unproductive, increasing the pressure on limited manpower and budget. Still, investigators treated every credible tip with seriousness because in missing child cases, a single verified observation can make the difference between closure and decades of unanswered questions. When an investigation identifies a potential suspect or a vehicle of interest, human nature and investigative instinct push attention toward those leads. That focus can yield results, or it can create an unintended tunnel vision effect in which other possibilities receive less attention. In Morgan's case, early attention concentrated on descriptions of an unknown man and a red pickup truck. Police questioned several individuals who matched various elements of witness descriptions and examined any vehicles that fit the profile. Each suspect interview required time, travel, background checks, and corroboration of alibis. Some individuals were cleared quickly, others remained persons of interest. When officers allocate substantial resources to one line of inquiry, it is important to maintain parallel paths, continue to search other leads, document alibis, and keep open the possibility of co-conspirators or alternative explanations. Investigators later reflected that, at times in the early stages, the sheer weight of community emotion and the volume of leads made it difficult to pursue multiple complex threads simultaneously with the thoroughness they warranted. The lesson: keep the tentacles of inquiry broad until evidence reliably narrows the scope. Another early challenge was the state of forensics at the time. In 1995, DNA analysis was available, but databases were small, turnaround times were longer, and techniques like genetic genealogy did not exist. What that meant practically was twofold. First, any physical evidence collected needed meticulous preservation for the future. Second, many trace items could not be definitively linked to individuals without a reference sample. Evidence preservation was hampered by the uncontrolled scene and by the limitations of the period's tools. Items such as hairs, fibers, or unidentifiable trace material were collected when possible, but the ability to compare them widely was restricted. Investigators knew that some physical clues might not be immediately decisive, but they also understood the value of cataloging and storing materials, because technological advances could someday turn minor traces into powerful leads. That foresight became salient years later when re-examinations of preserved items allowed modern labs to test samples with far greater sensitivity and context than had been possible in the 1990s. In this way, procedural diligence in evidence handling even under imperfect initial conditions provided a bridge to future breakthroughs. Alma's police department in 1995 was not a metropolitan agency with hundreds of detectives and an army of forensic technicians. It was, like many small jurisdictions, a local force thrown into a national spotlight. coordinating with county, state, and federal partners when and how to call for outside assistance, how to manage criminal intelligence sharing, and how to preserve a clear chain of custody for evidence were operational realities that required experience and administrative capacity. At times, limited staffing and the administrative burden of a high-profile missing child case forced decisions. Prioritize certain leads, assign detectives for follow-up in rotations, and rely on volunteers for ground searches. Those choices are understandable, but they also reveal systemic weaknesses that modern protocols aim to correct. Rapid multi-agency coordination, prearranged plan activation for missing children, and scalable command structures to manage community volunteers while preserving potential evidence. The Alma investigation illustrated the strain on small agencies when a single incident demands resources well beyond their daily capacity. It also underscored the importance of interagency relationships and pre-planned mutual aid protocols that today help departments respond more cohesively in the critical first hours. Reflecting on the early investigation, law enforcement and observers have pointed to specific procedural challenges that, in hindsight, may have limited the case's early momentum. The community's swift mobilization to look for Morgan was heroic and sincere, but the search's lack of centralized coordination made it difficult for officers to maintain an intact scene. Volunteers traversed parking areas, walked field edges, and searched wooded patches, possibly disturbing trace evidence that might have existed in the moments after Morgan disappeared. In the first chaotic hours, some witness statements were collected in the heat of the moment rather than in a calm, structured setting. Interviewing a scared child on the same night of a traumatic event can produce useful recollections, but best practice suggests careful, staged re-interviews when witnesses can be debriefed more calmly to avoid conflating details. With hundreds or thousands of incoming leads, investigators had to decide which to pursue immediately. In some cases, tips that sounded promising were delayed while other leads were checked. That triage is unavoidable but can have consequences when the window to verify a time-sensitive lead closes. Some physical items collected in the 1990s could not be fully analyzed with the tools of that era. Whether because of technological limits or cost considerations, certain tests were not pursued immediately. Those materials, however, were preserved, a crucial decision that allowed later re-examination as scientific methods improved. These were not necessarily single, definable errors. Rather, they were systemic vulnerabilities, the combination of human urgency, limited resources, evolving best practices, and the constraints of 1995 forensics. Each would inform lessons for future investigations. Cold cases are rarely static. Files are opened, new detectives review old notebooks, and advances in science create opportunities to test previously indecipherable evidence. In the years after Morgan's disappearance, the case did not fade. New detectives joined the investigation. Old statements were reread. Evidence that had been cataloged in the 1990s was revisited in labs that could now produce more discriminating results. A pivotal moment came when investigators re-examined a vehicle tied to a long-standing line of inquiry, a red pickup truck with a camper shell reported near the ball field the night Morgan vanished. Advances in DNA testing and a renewed focus on the truck as a piece of physical evidence allowed analysts to test hairs and fibers taken from its interior with much greater precision than had been possible 2 decades earlier. Modern testing indicated a genetic link between at least one hair found in the vehicle and Morgan's immediate family, a result that investigators described as highly significant. These findings prompted renewed public statements, a revisited suspect focus, and new investigative steps. That development illustrates a key lesson: preserving evidence, even when it cannot be fully analyzed at the time, keeps the door open to future breakthroughs. It also shows that an investigation's arc can be long, sometimes spanning decades, and that scientific patience can be as important as investigative urgency. In the autumn of 2024, Alma authorities announced that forensic testing had produced evidence linking a deceased man who had been questioned decades earlier to the case. The man, publicly identified as Billy Jack Lincks, had once owned a red pickup truck similar to the one described by witnesses. He had been arrested months after Morgan's disappearance in connection with an attempted abduction and later convicted on separate charges. He died in 2000. Investigators said that hairs recovered from his former vehicle matched genetic markers consistent with Morgan's family, strengthening the conclusion that Morgan had been in that truck. Because the suspect was deceased, prosecutors could not bring new criminal charges, but the identification represented a substantial development in a case that had endured for nearly 3 decades. It is important to stress the careful legal and ethical framing here. Police named a suspect based on forensic links and corroborating investigative work. The individual was never prosecuted for Morgan's disappearance because he had already died. Public release of such findings carries weight and responsibility to the family, to the community, and to the fairness owed to historical subjects of investigation. Investigators were explicit that, while the new forensic evidence was compelling, many questions about motive, opportunity, and possible accomplices remained open. One of the most enduring and transformative aspects of this story is the response of Morgan's mother. Colleen Nick channeled her personal loss into public service, founding the Morgan Nick Foundation in 1996. The foundation's mission grew to include helping families of missing children navigate crises, educating communities about child safety, and promoting prevention and recovery resources. Over the years, the foundation has supported countless families, trained law enforcement personnel, and worked with schools and civic groups to spread awareness. That advocacy kept Morgan's name in public conversation and pressured institutions to sustain investigative attention. It also illustrated how individual grief can evolve into systemic change, resources that help other families, protocols that improve responses, and public awareness initiatives that keep cold cases from being forgotten. The Foundation's work became a tangible conduit between a personal tragedy and institutional learning. The community's role extended beyond the initial volunteer searches. Over the years, vigils, billboards, and media coverage preserved the memory of the disappearance and kept pressure on investigators. It also illustrated how individual grief can evolve into systemic change, resources that help other families, protocols that improve responses, and public awareness initiatives that keep cold cases from being forgotten. The Foundation's work became a tangible conduit between a personal tragedy and institutional learning. The community's role extended beyond the initial volunteer searches. Over the years, vigils, billboards, and media coverage preserved the memory of the disappearance and kept pressure on investigators. Media and community attention also play an advocacy role. They sustain the social will to maintain an investigation across decades. Morgan's case demonstrates how civic attention and journalistic scrutiny can be partners in long-term investigative persistence, provided both operate with discipline and restraint. When law enforcement agencies reflect on long, difficult investigations, they often produce institutional after-action critiques, frank assessments of what worked, what didn't, and how to do better. Implement a rapid command structure for volunteer searches, create designated evidence preservation roles, and train community search teams to work under directions so that good intentions do not compromise potential traces. Improve early witness screening and follow up with staged re-interviews conducted by trained interviewers to reduce conflation of details and ensure the most reliable recollections are captured. Use centralized digital logging systems that triage incoming information by verifiability and relevance, ensuring high-priority tips receive immediate follow-up while lower-priority tips are documented and scheduled for later review. Maintain rigorous chain of custody and storage protocols for all physical evidence, recognizing that technological advances may render once inconclusive materials decisive decades later. Develop clear triggers to involve state and federal resources quickly, ensuring small departments can scale up investigations without administrative friction or duplication of effort. Many of these practices are now standard in larger jurisdictions and are increasingly taught in regional training programs. Over time, these institutional lessons have improved the quality of early responses and increased the likelihood that a case will remain investigatively viable as forensic science advances. One of the subtle themes in this investigation is the interplay between scientific progress and investigative patience. Forensics does not replace good police work, it amplifies it. Evidence must be collected, preserved, and contextualized. Scientific testing can yield a match, but that match must be integrated with timelines, witness accounts, and a clear understanding of how evidence could have arrived where it was found. In the Morgan Nick case, investigators preserved items and continued to pursue leads even when immediate results were scarce. Those choices paid dividends when labs in later years tested materials with techniques far more sensitive than anything available in 1995. The discovery of a hair in a truck years later demonstrated that methodical evidence handling could bridge the gap between the limits of one era and the possibilities of another. This requires both resources and resolve, the will to keep a file active, the funding to store and maintain evidence, and the leadership that prioritizes long-term investigative integrity over short-term closure. The Morgan case shows that when those elements align, science and patience can produce progress even after decades. When authorities announce significant developments in historical cases, they must balance transparency with responsibility. Naming a suspect, especially one who is deceased and therefore cannot be tried, raises complex ethical questions. Families deserve clarity, communities seek assurance, and the public expects accountable law enforcement communications. In the Alma investigation, officials were deliberate in their public statements. They described forensic findings, explained what the results suggested, and emphasized that work continued. Investigators were careful to avoid definitive language that could be misconstrued as a legal judgment. They invited anyone with additional information to come forward. This approach recognizes that criminal investigations are not solely scientific exercises. They involve reputations, familial grief, and community trust. Open, precise communication helps maintain that trust without conflating evidence with verdicts. The need for rapid, regionally coordinated alert systems to notify the public about potentially abductions has been reinforced by many cases. In Arkansas, early child abduction notification systems at times bore Morgan's name, reflecting how a single case can catalyze statewide awareness and structural change. Ensuring small departments have access to training on mass volunteer management, early evidence preservation, and interagency coordination helps reduce the initial vulnerabilities that can hinder investigations. Cold cases require archival resources, consistent investigative oversight, and periodic forensic retesting. Funding models that support sustained investigative investment increase the chances of eventual resolution. Organizations like the Morgan Nick Foundation have highlighted the essential role of family advocacy, both for keeping cases visible and for creating structures to support other families in crisis. Public policy that supports such advocacy organizations strengthens community resilience and victim support networks. At the center of every missing child case sits a family whose life is forever altered. For the Nick family, each year is a reminder of unresolved loss and the persistence of hope. Colleen's advocacy and the work of many volunteers kept Morgan's name in the public domain and helped push the investigative work forward. The human toll is not only emotional but procedural. The investment of time, the repeated reopening of files, the interviews that must be revisited, and the legal and scientific traverses that follow each new lead. Families live in public and private grief, and their perseverance often becomes the case's most durable engine. It's also worth noting that community vigilance, the local volunteers, the news outlets that kept the story alive, and the nonprofit organizations that provided resources sustained a social memory that institutional mechanisms alone might not have preserved. In that way, community and family advocacy operate as both moral force and practical vector for investigative longevity. Because Morgan's disappearance has remained in the public eye for decades, it continues to be studied in training programs and policy reviews. Her case appears in discussions about volunteer management, evidence preservation, and the integration of emerging forensic tools into older investigations. It serves as a cautionary tale about early procedural vulnerabilities and as an example of how sustained attention and modern science can shift an investigation's trajectory. Across jurisdictions, law enforcement agencies now approach missing child reports with standardized rapid response protocols, structured interviewing techniques, and integrated tip triage systems intended to avoid the same missteps that complicated earlier probes. These are practical, adoptable reforms rooted directly in cases. 3 decades after that warm night at the ballpark, the facts remain both clearer and more complicated than they once were. Investigators have said they have evidence that points to a suspect, Laboratories have produced DNA results that were impossible to obtain in 1995. But the central question endures: where is Morgan? The answer to that question carries moral weight beyond policing. It is about a community's promise to its children, about the obligations of institutions to learn and improve, and about a mother's relentless insistence that her child be remembered. There is comfort in some truths. Forensic science grows, protocols improve, and institutions learn from their histories. There is sorrow in others. The passage of time can close legal options and complicate the path to courtroom resolution. Yet the arc of this investigation also illuminates a hard-earned source of hope that careful preservation of evidence, thoughtful institutional reform, and tireless advocacy can converge to reveal answers even after many years. If there is a single, profound lesson from the Morgan-Nick investigation, it is this: the first hours matter, but so does what happens afterward. Procedural discipline at the outset preserves possibilities. Persistence over time transforms possibilities into answers. The two together, immediate rigor and long-term resolve, form the best hope for families who wake one evening to find someone missing from their lives. Morgan's story propelled improvements in missing child response and inspired a foundation that now helps others navigate loss. Her name remains a constant in a conversation about how communities and law enforcement can better protect children and respond when a child is taken. The work continues. The search is not over. And the enduring commitment of investigators, advocates, and a grieving but resolute family keeps the possibility of truth alive.